Godwin, the illustrious Earl of Wessex, is often immortalised in history as an unparalleled kingmaker, a figure who lived through the reigns of 7 kings of England. Emerging from the shadows of obscurity, Godwin's ascent was nothing short of extraordinary. Through strategic brilliance, he established the formidable house of Godwin, a dynasty and a clan that would become the most powerful in England. Despite the turbulent shifts in power over the years, Godwin's prowess as a master tactician remained unchallenged. Throughout the reigns of Cnut the Great's sons, he demonstrated an ability to maneuver the political landscape, often pulling the strings behind the throne. At the height of Godwin's power, he ruled England in all but name, a sovereign without a crown, having more wealth and influence than the king himself. His legacy was not merely of his own rise, but the meticulous grooming of his son Harold Godwinson. His story is one of a meteoric rise, a journey that would shape the future of England itself. This is his story. Godwin's birth was estimated to be anywhere from the year 993 to the year 1001, where the current King of England was Ethelred the Unready, and he had been ruling the country for many years. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Godwin's father was Wulfnoth Sild, a South Saxon thegn and aristocrat who owned substantial amounts of land. Thanes ranked at the 3rd level in lay society, below the king and ealdorman. In the year 1008, King Ethelred the Unready decreed the construction of a mighty fleet, and by the following year, a formidable armada of 300 ships assembled at Sandwich in Kent, ready to repel the looming threat of the Vikings. Amidst this gathering, Britric, the brother of the infamous Edric Striona, levelled unknown accusations against Wulfnoth before the king, charges deemed unjust by the chronicler John of Worcester. In response to this betrayal, Wulfnoth seized 20 ships and unleashed havoc upon the southern coast. However, this left Kent vulnerable, and soon it would be attacked by the Jom's Vikings, which would devastate the country for many years. As retribution, Ethelred almost certainly confiscated Wulfnoth's properties, and he was accused of treason. By the year 1014, Wulfnoth Sild had perished, leaving behind a young son, Godwin, who was probably in his teens. Burdened with the legacy of a disgraced traitor, the young Godwin's reputation was already tarnished, a shadow that would haunt his early years and shape his destiny. Despite this stain of rebellion, Godwin's lineage was rich with regal blood. Historians and chroniclers have linked Earl Godwin's ancestry to Ethelred I of Wessex, the elder brother of Alfred the Great, and both being direct descendants of King Egbert. This connection places the House of Godwin as a branch of the illustrious House of Cerdic, founded by Cerdic of Wessex, the leader of the Anglo-Saxon settlement in Britain, hailing from the distant Germanic lands. Godwin first emerges in the annals of history as a devoted adherent of Aethelstan Atheling, the eldest son of Ethelred the Unready. Aethelstan was known to be a warrior prince, and he amassed an impressive collection of swords, prized war horses, and combat equipment by the time of his untimely death. Both men had spent their formative years in Sussex, and it was within this setting that Godwin, despite the shadow of treachery cast by his father's deeds, forged a bond of friendship with the noble prince. Upon Aethelstan's death, he gifted an estate to his friend Godwin, marking the inception of Godwin's ascent to power. This inheritance bestowed upon him a modest level of wealth, a foothold in a world where he was but a feather in the wind, devoid of political influence or military might. Yet, even as Aethelstan Aetheling's life came to an end, England found itself confronting a peril unmatched since the onslaught of the Great Heathen Army, which came to England some 150 years earlier. However, in recent times, The Vikings had ravaged the land, plunging it into chaos, a tumultuous backdrop against which Sweyn Forkbeard seized his opportunity to invade, and ultimately crowned himself as the King of England. Thus, amid the turmoil and upheaval, began the rise of Godwin, a man whose legacy would be forged in the crucible of conflict and ambition. Although Sweyn had conquered and began to organise his vast new kingdom, he died after having ruled England for only 5 weeks. Sweyn's cause of death is unknown. Some theorise that he was murdered, perhaps by those loyal to Ethelred the Unready, whereas other sources say he died after falling off a horse. Folklore would have it that Sweyn Forkbeard apparently was murdered in his bed. The weapon was allegedly a spear, and the killer was the ghost of St Edmund, a dead king of East Anglia, seeking revenge for his own death at the hands of the monarch's Viking predecessors. With the Viking grip on England loosened, Godwin is believed to have pledged his allegiance to Ethelstan's brother, Edmund Ironside. Ethelred was then recalled from his exile, successfully expelling Sweyn's son Prince Cnut from the country. However, Cnut soon returned leading a formidable army. During this renewed Viking invasion, King Ethelred succumbed to illness, leaving his son Edmund to ascend the throne and valiantly defend his ancestral lands. It's likely that Godwin, honouring the memory of his fallen friend Ethelstan, sided with Edmund, now the King of England and renowned for his prowess as a formidable warrior. In these tumultuous times, Godwin's loyalty to Edmund marked a pivotal chapter in his journey, aligning himself with the king who embodied the spirit of resistance and determination. This alliance with the warrior king would be a defining moment in Godwin's rise, cementing him as a man of unwavering fidelity and ambition. Godwin fought beside Edmund in many a battle, perhaps even being present at the climactic conflict of the Battle of Assendon, where Cnut and Edmund made an agreement to co-rule England. Tragically, Edmund's reign was short-lived. He perished soon after, either by treachery or a festering battle wound, with one account chillingly suggesting an assassination in the privy. Thus, the tides of fate carried Godwin into the service of Cnut, the undisputed Viking King of England. In the shadow of this formidable ruler, Godwin's journey continued, his destiny entwined with the rise and fall of kings. He saw firsthand the fragility of life, the fleeting nature of power, and the perilous reality that loyalty could be a death sentence. The annihilation of the House of Wessex and the fall of the English royal lineage perhaps shaped the essence of Godwin's character, compounded by the treachery of his father. In a bid to erase his father's sins and cleanse the stain of rebellion from his own reputation, Godwin strove to act with righteousness. Yet, despite his efforts, the indelible mark of his past could not be expunged. Respect is something he would have to earn through obtaining absolute power. With Edmund's death in the year 1016 and Cnut's ascension to the English throne, Godwin made his peace with the new ruler, demonstrating unwavering loyalty. Cnut, who held loyalty in the highest regard, remembered how his fallen adversary Edmund had a steadfast and battle-hardened thane by his side in Godwin. This loyalty endeared Godwin to the new king, cementing his place in the reformed order of the realm. Cnut had redistributed the earldoms, giving East Anglia to Thorkel the Tall, and Northumbria would go to Earl Eric, the governor of Norway, and Cnut would keep Wessex for himself. By the year 1020, 4 years into Cnut's reign, Godwin accompanied the king on a grand expedition to Denmark. With Cnut having just ascended to the Danish throne following his brother's death, he faced the daunting task of quelling rival claimants and rebellions. Amidst this turmoil, Godwin distinguished himself by leading an English army to decisively crush a rebellion in one of Cnut's territories. In recognition of his valour and unwavering loyalty, Godwin was rewarded with the most prized and affluent lands in England, Wessex. Cnut respected and trusted Godwin to the extent that he gave him his own sister to wife, Tura Svendottir, in marriage. Although Tura's life was tragically brief, with her dying not long after their union, it symbolised the profound bond and mutual respect between the king and his newly appointed Earl. Godwin, still young and with his blood still running hot, was in need of a wife. A tale in the Knitling saga recounts that during Cnut's invasion of Denmark, a Danish jarl named Ulf became lost and was guided back to his ships by a handsome, well-spoken youth. The youth so impressed Ulf that he arranged for him to marry his sister, Gyða Thorkelsdottir. Gyða, like Godwin's first wife, hailed from an impeccable Scandinavian lineage. On one side of her line, she was the great-granddaughter of the Danish king Harald Bluetooth, and on the other side, she was the granddaughter of the Swedish prince Stribbjorn the Strong, renowned for his battle prowess. This union further solidified Godwin's ties to the noble Scandinavian bloodlines, which would enable his own sons to become lords and noblemen, and perhaps kings. This positioned Godwin at the very heart of the Anglo-Scandinavian power base. Commanding an army for Cnut in Denmark, he was thought to be in his early 20s, and he swiftly rose to become the king's confidant and closest advisor. With Cnut's power base and headquarters being in England, Godwin often had the king's ear regarding problems with his many kingdoms. This was possible for Godwin, as by the year 1023, Cnut's two senior advisors had been removed from the scene. Earl Eric of Norway had passed away, and Earl Thorkel the Tall, Cnut's regent in Denmark and a legendary warrior, attempted to incite a rebellion in response to Cnut's extensive church-building efforts. As a staunch pagan, Thorkel opposed the Christian regime taking root under Cnut's rule. In a dramatic clash of beliefs and power, Cnut, with the aid of Godwin, suppressed Thorkel's rebellion. This decisive show of power not only reinforced Cnut's authority, but also showcased Godwin's loyalty and prowess, solidifying his standing in Cnut's ever-changing court. Despite a subsequent reconciliation, Cnut never allowed Thorkel to return to England. Thus, in choosing his chief advisor, Cnut entrusted the role to Godwin, now a proven battle commander. As a reward for his loyalty and service, Godwin's influence expanded further, with Kent being added to his earldom. This elevation solidified his status as the most trusted and powerful man in England. Cnut, the mighty king of Denmark and England, faced opportunistic attacks from Olaf II of Norway and Anud Jacob of Sweden. These kings sought to exploit Cnut's deep commitment in England by launching assaults on Danish territories in the Baltic Sea. By the year 1026, Cnut retaliated with a formidable fleet, commanding a vast array of Danes and Englishmen. It remains unclear whether Godwin accompanied him into battle or stayed in England governing alongside Cnut's wife Emma of Normandy. Nevertheless, Cnut triumphed, decisively driving Olaf into exile, and by the year 1028, securing his rule over England, Denmark and Norway, thus becoming the overlord of the North Sea Empire. During this period of unprecedented power, Godwin, the Earl of Wessex, stood as Cnut's right-hand man. Cnut amassed immense wealth as the sovereign of 3 kingdoms, presiding over an era of extended peace. Simultaneously, Godwin's fortunes soared, his loyalty and service richly rewarded, allowing him to attain extraordinary wealth and influence. Their partnership symbolised the height of Anglo-Scandinavian dominance, with Cnut and Godwin steering the course of an empire. For 7 years, from the years 1028 to 1035, Godwin would enjoy a rare position. Rising from the son of a disgraced traitor, he clawed his way through the ranks of nobility, establishing his own house, the House of Godwin. He was now the right-hand man to arguably one of the most powerful men in the world at the time. As a respected member of Cnut's court, Godwin immersed himself in the intricate affairs of England, Denmark, and Norway, cementing his legacy as a masterful player in the grand arena of medieval politics. However, in the year 1035, Cnut would fall ill and die, his empire being held together by his brilliance and reputation alone. His sons would then vie for his kingdoms, as would other would-be kings. The son of Olaf II, Magnus the Good, would take Norway shortly after Cnut's death, leaving that part of the empire in the hands of another dynasty. Upon Cnut's passing, his death ignited a fierce contest for the throne between his two sons, Harthacnut, born from his wife Emma of Normandy, and Harold Harefoot, the offspring of his handfast wife, Elfgifu of Northampton. Harthacnut was entrusted with the regency of Denmark by his father, and he remained occupied in the north, while Harefoot, bolstered by his mother's kin, positioned himself in England. The English witan gathered to determine the rightful heir, but the assembly was sharply divided. The powerful factions of the Mercians, Northumbrians, and Cnut's formidable fleet rallied behind Harefoot. In contrast, the support for Harthacnut came from Queen Emma, the Archbishop, Godwin, and the loyal men of Wessex. Historical accounts suggest that Cnut had intended for Harthacnut to succeed him, a plan Godwin evidently supported. During this tumultuous time, both brothers laid claim to the throne, leading to the minting of coins in both their respective names. The expectation was that Harthacnut would soon voyage to England to assert his claim before the witan. However, his commitments in Denmark, particularly the pressing threat from a resurgent Norway under Magnus, hindered his ability to leave. In the year 1036, Harold seized this opportunity presented by Harthacnut's absence. He boldly marched south and seized the national treasury at Winchester, a strategic stronghold within Queen Emma's dowager lands and at the heart of Godwin's Wessex. This audacious manoeuvre dramatically intensified the battle for the English crown. Emma, forsaking the claim of her son Harthacnut, sought refuge with her exiled sons from Ethelred the Unready, who resided in Normandy. As she made her desperate plea, Harold Harefoot's position gained traction, and the even once steadfast Godwin began to waver in his allegiance. The Atheling brothers, Edward and Alfred, sons of the old dead king Ethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy, arrived in England under uncertain pretenses. Edward, landing at Southampton, faced local opposition and was compelled to retreat back to Normandy. His entourage of French and Norman forces may have been perceived as a threat, influencing his reception. Meanwhile, his brother Alfred made his way to London, bolstering his claim with a contingent from Boulogne and Norman mercenaries. To Harold, Alfred's advance could only be interpreted as a direct challenge. The situation of succession within England, already fraught with tension, was further complicated by the arrival of this additional Atheling. Alfred's subsequent actions only intensified the strife. At Guildford, Godwin intercepted the Atheling with his own forces, either detaining or offering protection to him. Historical accounts diverge on the exact nature of Godwin's involvement, some stating he was an agent of Harold Harefoot, and others that he wanted to help a young Alfred. No matter what his intentions, Harefoot, perceiving Alfred's presence as a threat, dispatched his personal guard to seize him. They clashed with Alfred's men, resulting in the deaths of several warriors before capturing Alfred himself. The Etheling was later subjugated to the cruel practice of blinding. The procedure was poorly executed, leading to Alfred's death from an ensuing infection. The shadow of suspicion loomed over Godwin for the remainder of his days, cast by the grim events surrounding Prince Alfred. Initially, Godwin had confronted Alfred's forces, and the subsequent death of the prince became a dark cloud over his legacy. Questions would linger. Did Godwin, in a bid to secure his own ascendancy and retain his earldom, align himself with Harold Harefoot? Or did he merely hand over Alfred, unaware of the cruel fate that awaited him? The true nature of Godwin's actions remains shrouded in the mists of time. In the year 1037, Harold Harefoot was recognised as king all over England. Godwin would remain the Earl of Wessex, and his status was retained. By the year 1039, Harthacnut, the heir of Cnut and the rival claimant to the English throne, had come to an agreement with Magnus of Norway, and was now ready to challenge Harold Harefoot's rule. With his ambitions ignited, Harthacnut set sail with a formidable fleet destined for Flanders. There, he planned to fortify his claim to the English throne by rallying a formidable army. However, as Harthacnut prepared for his campaign, destiny took a sudden turn. King Harold Harefoot, his reign marked by intrigue and conflict, passed away in the stillness of his bedchamber. The king's death cast a profound shift in the realm, setting the stage for a dramatic upheaval. It is unknown if Harefoot was murdered, died of illness, or was poisoned. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, everyone who once admired him now turned against him. Furthermore, he did nothing of note throughout his entire reign, and his illness was due to divine judgment. Another source notes, he went astray from the qualities and conduct of his father Cnut. He cared not at all for knighthood, for courtesy or for honour, but only for his own will. This left Godwin in a precarious position. As the Earl of Wessex, he faced the wary eyes of Harthacnut and his mother Emma of Normandy. Their suspicions were fueled by the allegations that Godwin had played a part in the murder of Alfred Etheling, Harthacnut's half-brother, and Emma's beloved son. With Harefoot's death, there would now be no war between the brothers. England was without a champion to stand against Harthacnut's formidable forces. Seizing this opportune moment, Harthacnut advanced into England with his army, swiftly claiming the throne. The Witan, recognising his authority, declared him king without hesitation. Godwin, ever loyal to his late master's wishes, supported Harthacnut's ascension, determined to see Cnut's final will enforced. However, Harthacnut would prove to be a tyrant. Although Godwin had been Harthacnut's staunchest supporter, Harthacnut had heard the rumours of Godwin's involvement in the death of his half-brother Alfred. His mother, Emma of Normandy, was also furious, accusing Godwin of the crime, alongside other members of the Witan. During this tumultuous time, Godwin had amassed immense wealth, having faithfully served Cnut for 15 years, and Harold Harefoot for 5. His influence was boundless, making him the most powerful man in the realm, and the richest, second only to the king himself. Harthacnut, as the ruling monarch of both Denmark and England, would have wielded power that eclipsed even Godwin's, granting him the upper hand at court. Godwin would stand trial, with Harthacnut himself presiding as the judge. The king permitted Godwin to present witnesses, who testified that he had only acted under Harefoot's orders, and he could not break his oath to him. In a gesture of reconciliation, and to cover the wergild he would have owed if found guilty, Godwin gifted Harthacnut a magnificently adorned ship, its splendour matching the weight of his supposed crime. Ultimately, Godwin was exonerated of all charges. Harthacnut, securing his authority, also required Godwin to swear an oath of fealty to him. But this was not all. In his anger, Harthacnut decreed that Godwin must witness and attend the desecration of Harefoot's tomb. The king's men exhumed Harefoot's body from its revered resting place at Westminster, in a spectacle meant to display the full extent of Harthacnut's fury. The corpse was dragged before a gathering crowd and subjected to the ultimate indignity. It was publicly beheaded, the severed head a stark symbol of the king's vengeance. Harefoot's remains were stripped of all honour and were then cast into a foul sewer, left to decay. This act was intended to erase Harefoot's legacy and assert Harthacnut's dominion. His early success in striking fear into the hearts of his subjects, including the formidable Godwin, still didn't put his mind at ease. Harthacnut would increase taxes owed to the crown, due to the English submitting to his brother Harold Harefoot. The common folk, already weary and oppressed, learned of the desecration of Harefoot's tomb, a sacrilege that chilled their souls. When coupled with the severe tax increases, their anger ignited into rebellion. Harthacnut's reign also coincided with an ill-fated harvest, which seems to have confirmed their worst fears. To the peasants and lords alike, the poor yields were a dire omen, a sign of divine wrath from the ungodly treatment of Harefoot's royal corpse. Starvation would grip the land, the fields barren and unyielding. The rising taxes drained the lifeblood of the people, driving them to the brink of madness. Riots erupted like wildfire, and in Worcester, the fury of the oppressed turned deadly. The king's tax gatherers were mercilessly slaughtered, their blood mingling with the stolen royal coin. In response, Harthacnut unleashed a punishment steeped in cruelty and ancient law. He would order a harrying, a ruthless punishment of mass slaughter. Harthacnut commanded his earls to reduce Worcester to ashes. Godwin, alongside other leading nobles, led the vengeful charge. The skies darkened with smoke as Worcester burned. Flames devoured the city, and the king's men, blades slick with blood, cut down the common folk without discrimination. To the commoners, Harthacnut's reign was that of a tyrant, whose reign was defined by fear, bloodshed, and an unrelenting thirst for power. 2 years into the reign of King Harthacnut, a grand wedding was held. The groom, Tovy the Proud, stood tall beside his bride Geitha, the radiant daughter of Osgod Clapper. Both men had shared a deep bond with the late King Cnut, their loyalties entwined with his royal bloodline. The celebration was in full swing, the hall alive with music. Harthacnut raised his goblet to toast the union. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Harthacnut died as he stood at his drink, and he suddenly fell to the earth with an awful convulsion, and those who were close by took hold of him, and he spoke no word afterwards. The king had been poisoned. The moment his cup was drained, his fate was sealed. In an instant, he was writhing on the ground, and despite the efforts of those nearby, he never uttered another word. Speculation ran rampant. However, the culprit of this treacherous act remains a mystery. Whispers pointed to Edward the Confessor, Harthacnut's half-brother, and the last surviving son of Ethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy. Edward stood to gain the throne, his ambition marked by a guise of piety. Yet, some eyes turned towards Earl Godwin, a man whose power matched his cunning. His role in orchestrating the poison was plausible, given his rare rise to power and his deep connection to the other English nobles. Nevertheless, the true identity of Harthacnut's murder has been swallowed by the sands of time. a secret so well kept that it evades even the most diligent of historians. The death of Harthacnut marked a pivotal moment, the end of Cnut the Great's dynasty and line, and the restoration of the House of Wessex. Upon the untimely death of Harthacnut, the realm of England stood at a crossroads. The Witan, the assembly of the kingdom's most powerful nobles, convened to consider the future of the throne. Danish claims, remnants of the Viking era, loomed heavily over their deliberations. Yet amidst this turmoil, one man's influence would tip the scales: Godwin, the most powerful of the English earls. A master of political manoeuvring, recognised the opportunity to shape the kingdom's destiny. With a vision clear and resolute, he threw his considerable weight behind Edward's claim, the son of Ethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy, who had long resided in exile. Godwin's support was not merely vocal. He dispatched his own fleet to Normandy, ensuring Edward's safe passage back to England. In the council chambers and great halls, Godwin's voice resonated. His arguments were compelling, invoking a shared sense of identity and a vision of a united England, free from foreign domination. Noble by noble, the tide began to turn. As the Witan deliberated, the once formidable Danish claims began to lose their appeal. Edward's noble lineage, his ties to both the ancient English and Norman bloodlines, emerged as a beacon of hope for the fractured nation. When the moment of decision arrived, it was Edward whom the Witan chose to ascend to the throne. Godwin's calculated actions had not only secured Edward's kingship, but he also cemented his own legacy as a kingmaker, a strategist whose vision and influence would shape the future of England. Thus, England embarked on a new chapter, guided by the steady hand of Godwin and the reign of Edward the Confessor. This was now the fourth king whom Godwin would serve. He was the most experienced political player in the kingdom, and by far the richest. This would foreshadow the later clashes between the inexperienced king and the formidable Earl. During Godwin's time as the Earl of Wessex, he fathered many children. His first son was named Sweyn, his second Harold, then there was Tostig, Gurth and Leofwine, and finally came Wulfnoth. Godwin's wife Geitha also gave him 3 daughters, Edith, Gunhilda and Elfgifu. With respect to his wife's noble lineage and the venerable traditions of Scandinavia, the sons of Godwin bore their father's name as a badge of honour, each one proudly taking the surname Godwinson, signifying the son of Godwin. Through this custom, the House of Godwin was firmly established. This tradition not only honoured their patriarch, but also cemented the family's place among the nobility, ensuring that the name Godwin would echo across generations and borders. Edward, moulded more by Norman culture than by his English heritage, had spent the majority of his years since the death of his father Ethelred in the comfort of his mother's Norman homeland. His return to England saw him heavily reliant on the might and influence of the 3 paramount earls of the realm, Siward of Northumbria, Leofric of Mercia, and Godwin of Wessex. Among these titans, it was Godwin who wielded the greatest power. In the pivotal year of the year 1043, bolstered by the unwavering support of these 3 earls, Edward made a decisive move against his mother, Emma. He felt abandoned by her, left forgotten in Normandy, as her favourite son was her heir Harthacnut, who was now dead. Edward stripped her of her lands and vast treasures. He consolidated his power and rewarded his loyal supporters. The alliance between Edward and Godwin would reach its height in the year 1045, with Edward's marriage to Godwin's daughter Edith. This union was not just a matrimonial bond, but a strategic alliance, sealing Godwin's position as the king's foremost advisor and confidant. During this time, Godwin provided counsel and guidance to Edward, helping him navigate the complexities of ruling a diverse and often turbulent kingdom. Godwin saw his influence reach unprecedented heights as he strategically placed his sons in positions of power. Sweyn, the eldest, was granted the lower lands of Mercia and the Welsh marshes, while Harold, his second son, was given dominion over East Anglia. In the grand halls of court, Godwin stood as Edward's most trusted advisor, his counsel shaping the king's decisions. In the private sanctity of the royal bedchamber, Edith, Godwin's daughter, and now the Queen, whispered her own influences, ensuring the House of Godwin ascended to unparalleled prominence. However, Edward, while grateful for Godwin's support, began to shift the balance of power. He started to introduce Normans, companions from his years in exile, into key positions within the English court. This infusion of Norman influence signalled Edward's intent to blend his Norman affinities with his English kingship. Every family has its black sheep, and for the Godwins, that role was filled by Sweyn. His talent for trouble was legendary, but it was his scandalous seduction of an abbess and refusing to give her up for a year that led to his exile. However, Godwin, using his formidable sway, orchestrated Sweyn's return from exile. Upon his return, he found his previous holdings in disarray. His lands had been divided, with significant portions of them absorbed into his younger brother Harold's domain. Despite his restoration to court, Sweyn held no real power. His lands were now controlled by his cousin and his younger brother. Consumed by anger and ambition, Sweyn committed the heinous act of murdering his cousin. Seeking redemption, Sweyn embarked on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, hoping to atone for his grievous sins. However, Sweyn would perish on his return home, never to reclaim his former glory. With Sweyn's demise, Harold, Godwin's second son, was named his heir, solidifying his place as the primary successor to his father's legacy. From humble beginnings, Godwin had forged a noble house, and it was the most powerful one in the kingdom. Also, the Godwin family now held 3 earldoms, only Mercia and Northumbria remaining in other hands. In addition, with Edith as queen, the Godwin family's influence infiltrated every corner of the kingdom. Moreover, Edward had only recently returned to England as a half-Norman stranger, with no experience of English politics or any kind of leadership. A struggle for power would now begin between the formidable Earl and the inexperienced king. Edward's personal estates paled in comparison to the vast lands and resources controlled by Godwin. The Earl's wealth was legendary, his experience in the art of politics unparalleled, and his wisdom in navigating the treacherous waters of power plays was unmatched. It was said that Godwin, more than any other, held the reins of the kingdom. King Edward seemed content to let Godwin and his formidable house manage the kingdom, a task they performed with notable fairness and skill. This arrangement allowed Edward to indulge in his own interests, many of which were rooted in his years spent in Normandy. Among his closest friends was Count Eustace of Boulogne. One fateful day after visiting the king, Eustace and his retinue set off to return to Normandy, passing through Dover on their way. The Normans, brimming with entitlement, rode into the town and demanded accommodation. A local householder, wary of these armed foreigners, refused them entry. In retaliation, the Normans attacked, wounding the householder and sparking a violent confrontation. The brawl quickly escalated, resulting in nearly 40 deaths, with many Normans among the casualties. Enraged, Eustace hurried back to his friend King Edward, demanding retribution. King Edward would take the side of his friend Eustace, saying he had been attacked. He would immediately summon Godwin, insisting that the town was situated within Godwin's earldom, thus it was his responsibility. Godwin, ever the voice of reason, responded that the king's justice could not be carried out without a proper hearing of the case. This measured reply only fueled Edward's anger, and in a rare episode, Edward the Confessor would fly into a blind rage, rendering him impervious to reason. Egged on by his Norman advisors, Edward blamed Godwin for the murder of Alfred, his half-brother, a charge King Harthacnut and the Witan had already acquitted him of. This renewed accusation, despite Godwin's previous exoneration, intensified the tension between the king and his most powerful earl, setting the stage for a dramatic confrontation. In this volatile atmosphere, the kingdom was on the brink of chaos. Godwin, the most powerful man in the realm, knew he was no longer welcome at court, and King Edward, consumed by rage and resentment, had grown weary of the Godwin family's dominance, aware that they were the true rulers of England. Faced with the king's blind fury and baseless accusations, Godwin swiftly took action, summoning his sons. He issued a command to gather an army. He would rally the men of Wessex, while Harold would muster the forces of East Anglia. His other sons too were dispatched to gather loyal followers from across the land. Meanwhile, Edward fortified his own position, rallying his supporters. By his side stood the Normans, skilled in battle and renowned for their armour. In addition, Edward secured the allegiance of the English earls, Leofric of Mercia and Siward of Northumbria. These earls, perhaps eager to see their rival house of Godwin humbled, pledged their support to the king. The men of Wessex, hardened by years of service under the formidable Earl, readied themselves for battle. Godwin's second son Harold, a rising star in his own right, rallied East Anglia, his charisma and leadership inspiring confidence in their cause. King Edward was soon informed that Godwin and his armed host were on the move. The formidable Earl, undeterred by the king's wrath, demanded a chance to refute the charges of Alfred's murder and sought to bring Eustace to trial for the violence in Dover. Edward, sensing the gravity of the situation, stalled for time and summoned the northern earls. The cry of treason echoed through the court, and the response was swift. The northern earls, accompanied by their shire feuds, marched south, ready to confront Godwin. The stage was set for civil war, and a crucial meeting was arranged to take place in London to resolve the crisis. As the Godwins' army approached the capital, they found themselves face to face with their king. Despite their loyalty to Godwin, the sight of Edward, their sovereign, caused hesitation among the ranks. Fearful of the repercussions, land confiscations, and the wrath of the church, many of Godwin's troops began to disband. Seizing the moment, Edward declared that Godwin and his son Harold present themselves before the throne. Godwin, wary of a trap, sought assurances for his safety, but Edward remained adamant, offering none. Cornered and outmaneuvered, Godwin faced an impossible choice: surrender and risk his life, or stand firm and plunge the realm into war. Realizing the futility of resistance, Godwin prepared for exile. By early October, Godwin and his sons were declared outlaws and were given 5 days to leave England. The men of Dover, who had sparked the initial conflict, went unpunished. Godwin, accompanied by his wife Geitha and sons Tostig and Gurth, fled to Flanders. Harold and Leofwine would set sail for the Norse stronghold of Dublin, seeking refuge among the Viking warriors. Meanwhile, Godwin's daughter Edith, the Queen, was sent to a nunnery, stripped of her royal possessions, a stark reminder of the king's absolute authority. Thus, the once mighty House of Godwin was scattered, their power broken, their influence diminished. Edward's calculated moves had not only neutralised his greatest rival, but also reaffirmed his control over the kingdom. The shadow of Godwin's ambition faded, leaving Edward to rule unchallenged, his throne secure. For now. It couldn't last. Word of the king's ruthless actions spread like wildfire, igniting a wave of dissent across the kingdom. Public opinion swelled against Edward, fueled by the common folk's outrage. The Englishmen denied the two fundamental rights they cherished above all else, the right to live in peace in their homes and the protection of the law. The common people also revered Godwin, remembering him as the steadfast Earl who had championed peace and fairness for decades. Under his stewardship, the kingdom had thrived and justice had been accessible to all. In stark contrast, King Edward, enslaved by the influence of his Norman allies, appeared indifferent to his own subjects' needs. He favoured the interests of his Norman friends over the welfare of the English people, a betrayal that did not go unnoticed. The tales of Edward's betrayal resonated through villages and towns, stirring a collective memory of better days under Godwin's rule. Murmurs of discontent grew louder, evolving into cries for justice. The Englishmen, known for their resilience and valour, began to prepare for resistance. They could no longer tolerate a king who had turned their back on them, forsaking the very people he had sworn to protect. Thus, the seeds of rebellion were sown in the hearts of the common folk, who yearned for the return of a leader who embodied their ideals. Meanwhile, in Flanders, Godwin, with his vast hoards of gold, was amassing an army of mercenaries. In the year 1052, Godwin made a bold move, landing on the Isle of Wight to gauge the loyalty of the men of Wessex. These men, who had known Godwin as their lord for over 30 years, remembered his fair and just rule. With a sense of nostalgia and loyalty, they rallied to his side, providing support and supplies. Godwin showed no mercy to those who hesitated, ravaging their lands and re-establishing himself as the Earl of Wessex, without the king's consent. Shortly after Godwin's triumphant return to the Isle of Wight, his sons Harold and Leofwine sailed from Dublin with 9 ships, joining their father's ever-growing host. The threat to King Edward's rule had become palpable. In a desperate bid for support, Edward summoned the Earls of the realm. Yet the most powerful among them, Leofric of Mercia and Siward of Northumbria, sensed the shifting tides of public opinion and chose not to attend. The king found himself isolated, outnumbered, and bereft of the support of the mightiest lords in England. Godwin and his sons soon made their way to London, where Godwin's reputation and charm quickly won over the locals. Their support swelled his ranks, adding to the formidable force that now stood against the king. Sailing under London Bridge, Godwin's forces disembarked, facing Edward's army across the Thames once more, as they had in the year 1051. The air was thick with tension, the threat of bloodshed looming. Edward, despite his willingness to fight, was swayed by his fearful counsellors, aware of Godwin's wrath and influence. A truce was brokered, and a meeting of the Witan was called to determine England's fate. Godwin stood before the assembly, solemnly swearing an oath that he had no hand in Alfred Etheling's death, and that his family harboured no treasonous intent. The Witan and the reluctant king accepted his oath. The Godwin family were restored to their lands and positions, a development that deeply affected the balance of power in England. An arrangement was made that upon Godwin's death, Harold, his son, would inherit the earldom of Wessex. The Witan concluded that the crisis of the year 1051 had been fueled by bad counsellors who had influenced the king to make disastrous decisions. Consequently, Edward's Norman favourites at court were outlawed. Godwin had outmanoeuvred the king in a masterful display of political prowess. Edward, humbled and defeated, never again challenged Godwin's authority. The Godwin family once again ruled over England, their influence unchallenged. However, Godwin's triumph was to be short-lived, as the tides of fate were ever unpredictable. Godwin did not enjoy his triumph long. In the spring of the year 1053, while celebrating Easter at Winchester alongside some of his sons and King Edward, fate dealt him a final blow. In the midst of the festive occasion, Godwin suddenly collapsed. Over the course of a few agonizing days, his strength waned and he succumbed to death. In the following century, chroniclers would embolden this tale with vivid details, suggesting divine retribution for his alleged sins. The truth, however, is simpler. Godwin was at least 52 years old, though some estimations place his birth in the year 990, which would make him a man of 60 or more. He had lived well beyond the average lifespan of the time, having navigated the treacherous political waters of 7 English kings' reigns. Godwin's legacy is one of unparalleled ambition and skill. From humble beginnings, he rose to become England's most powerful man. He witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, serving under the rule of Cnut and his sons, and later Edward the Confessor. His life was marked by shrewd political manoeuvres and an unwavering drive for power. Upon King Edward's death, his son Harold Godwinson ascended to the throne, cementing the Godwin's family name in the annals of history. Harold Godwinson was the last Saxon king of England, his legacy often eclipsed by the bitter defeat of the Battle of Hastings. Yet, this singular bloody day does not define the man. Harold was a warrior of unparalleled ferocity, a general whose strategic genius brought the Viking age to a brutal end. His victory over Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, was a clash drenched in blood and thunder, resulting in many tales both in Viking sagas and in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Harold would also conquer Wales, and had a life that unfolded amidst one of England's most turbulent eras, a time rife with the fall of dynasties and the relentless uncertainty of fate. His legacy is one of immense victory, but also of crushing defeat, fighting to the bitter end. This is the story of the last Saxon king, Harold Godwinson. Harold Godwinson was born into a world awash in blood and conquest in the year 1022, a time when Viking rule held England in a tight grip, with Cnut the Great reigning supreme. His father Godwin had been elevated to the Earl of Wessex just 2 years before Harold's birth, a remarkable rise from obscurity orchestrated by Cnut himself. Godwin's lineage traced back to Wulfnoth Sild, a South Saxon thegn who had fallen from grace after rebelling against King Ethelred the Unready. Despite this stain of rebellion, Godwin's lineage was rich with regal blood. Historians and chroniclers have linked Earl Godwin's ancestry to Ethelred I of Wessex, the elder brother of Alfred the Great, and both being direct descendants of King Egbert. This connection places the House of Godwin as a branch of the illustrious House of Cerdic, founded by Cerdic of Wessex, the leader of the Anglo-Saxon settlement in Britain, hailing from the distant Germanic lands. Harold's mother, Gytha Thorkelsdottir, was a Danish noblewoman, the daughter of the formidable Danish chieftain, Thorgel Sparkling, though little is recorded of his exploits. Through Gytha, the blood of fierce Danish warriors coursed through Harold's veins, blending with the noble Saxon heritage of his father. Harold had around 5 brothers. There was Sweyn, Harold himself, Tostig, Gurth, Leofwine, and Wulfnoth. He also had 3 sisters, named Edith, Gunhild, and Elfgifu. Harold's father Godwin experienced a meteoric rise to prominence. By the time Cnut the Great met his end in the year 1035, Godwin had already cemented his status as one of England's wealthiest and most influential earls. Harold and his siblings thus grew up in an Anglo-Scandinavian England, basking in the privileges of high-ranking nobility. Following Cnut's death, his eldest son Harold Harefoot ascended to the English throne, bolstered by the unwavering support of Earl Godwin of Wessex. However, the realm was not at peace. Alfred Atheling, a son of the deposed King Ethelred the Unready, dared to reclaim his heritage, leading an invasion force comprised of Norman mercenaries. Earl Godwin, ever shrewd the tactician, intercepted Alfred's forces. In a dark act of betrayal, he handed Alfred over to Harold Harefoot. This treachery culminated in Alfred being blinded and brutally murdered. The blood of this betrayal tainted Godwin's name, staining his reputation. Yet, in the brutal calculus of power, his influence only grew. Harold Harefoot would die in the year 1040, and his brother Harthacnut would assume the English throne. Godwin would then back Harthacnut's ascension to the throne, again being on the right political side of the aspiring king, and retaining his lands and status. Harold Godwinson would have been around 20 years old during Harthacnut's ascension to the throne. He would swear an oath of loyalty to the king alongside his father, due to the murder of Alfred Atheling, ensuring the Godwinson family was once more in the king's favour. After just 2 years on the throne, however, Harthacnut met a ghastly fate at a wedding feast. It is reported that he suddenly fell to the earth with an awful convulsion, and he spoke no word afterwards. Another son of Cnut the Great had died childless, ending his line. With Harthacnut's death, the Viking grip on England loosened, and the line of English kings reverted to the ancient Wessex line. The last surviving son of Ethelred the Unready, Edward, was in exile in Normandy, but he was summoned back to England to claim his birthright. Earl Godwin, ever the puppet master, lent his formidable support to Edward's claim. Harold's father Godwin's backing of Edward the Confessor was not merely an act of loyalty, but a calculated move to solidify his own power and secure his family's future. Godwin's jurisdiction of his earldom would be extended to cover the rich lands of Kent. In the year 1045, Harold was appointed as the Earl of East Anglia, ascending to a position of immense power and influence. This elevation was undoubtedly swayed by his father Godwin's deep political connections with the king. Godwin, the wealthiest man in the realm, and arguably the most powerful, had manoeuvred to secure his family's prominence. The stature of the Godwinson family soared even higher that same year, when Harold's sister Edith wed King Edward. This union not only fortified the family's already substantial influence, but also bound Harold and the king by ties of brotherhood through marriage, making Edward the Confessor Harold's brother-in-law. The Godwinson family's ascent was now firmly entwined with the royal lineage. At around the same time as his sister, Harold would also marry. His wife was named Edith the Fair, although she is remembered to history as Edith Swanneck. She was an extremely wealthy and beautiful noblewoman from East Anglia, who herself had an impeccable lineage, with her mother being a Saxon princess. Although their marriage wasn't sanctioned by the church, and was done in the Danish manner, through a ceremony known as handfasting, this was seen as completely normal. The couple would have at least 6 children together, and their relationship was one of love, as well as a sound political move for both Harold and Edith. Harold had grown up during the reign of Viking kings, and although the line had been restored to the House of Wessex, he had witnessed dynasties fall. He also observed the political manoeuvring of his father Godwin to help secure his own interests, which had resulted in the Godwinson family rising from obscurity to becoming the most powerful house in England. This would have had a profound impact on Harold, who would have witnessed firsthand the impermanence of power, the fragility of life, and how to act during chaotic times. Harold's elder brother Sweyn had been appointed as the Earl of several boroughs, but he was exiled for abducting an abbess in the year 1047. His lands were then divided between Harold and his cousin. Thus, Harold was now his father's eldest legitimate son, with his older brother being in exile, and had absorbed some of his lands into his own. King Edward the Confessor would ally himself with Henry III, the Holy Roman Emperor. In the year 1049, Harold was dispatched to support Henry in this pact, commanding a fleet of ships sent to confront Baldwin, the Count of Flanders. Harold's role in this campaign underscored his growing prominence and the deepening ties between the English crown and the Holy Roman Empire. As King Edward the Confessor sought to consolidate his power, he drew advisors, nobles, and priests from his own Norman circle, heavily influenced by his mother's lineage. This influx of Norman influence was met with a staunch opposition from Godwin, who championed the interests of his countrymen. A violent clash in Dover between the townspeople and the visiting Eustace II, the Count of Boulogne, ignited a critical conflict. Edward commanded Godwin to punish the people of Dover, but Godwin defied his king, refusing to turn against his own people. This defiance was a bold stance against a foreign power, and also a direct challenge to Edward's authority. The Godwin family wielded immense power, controlling numerous earldoms, and even having a representative within the king's bedchamber. In stark contrast, King Edward's personal estate, though substantial, was likely smaller than that of his ancestors, and dispersed across various earldoms. This fragmentation left him without a consolidated local power base. Additionally, Edward had only recently returned to England as a half-Norman outsider, lacking experience in English politics and leadership. This set the stage for a power struggle between the formidable Earl and the inexperienced king. Edward perceived Godwin's refusal as a test of power, and quickly moved to secure the support of Siward, the Earl of Northumbria, and Leofric, the Earl of Mercia. With their backing, Edward successfully had Godwin detained and exiled in September of the year 1051, also remembering how Godwin had betrayed his brother, Alfred Atheling. Godwin, along with his wife Geitha and sons, Sweyn, Tostig and Gurth, sought refuge in Flanders. Meanwhile, his other sons, Leofwine and Harold, fled to Dublin. In the year 1052, Godwin and Harold launched small fleets and converged off the southwest coast of England. They then garnered support from the ports of Sussex and Kent, assembling a formidable force. This combined fleet sailed to London, where Godwin compelled the king to negotiate, threatening civil war. This resulted in a settlement entirely favourable to Godwin. Thus, the Godwin family's earldoms were restored, the Queen was recalled, and most of the king's numerous French favourites were outlawed. The Godwinson family had so firmly re-established its grip on power that Edward never again attempted to challenge them. However, Godwin's triumph was short-lived. In the year 1053, just 1 year later, while celebrating Easter at Winchester with some of his sons and the king, he suddenly collapsed, and there at the height of his power, died at the feast. Godwin's second son, Harold, succeeded him as the Earl of Wessex, while Harold's former earldom of East Anglia was bestowed upon Elfgar, the son of the Earl of Mercia. Godwin's eldest son, Sweyn, was ineligible for any titles due to his pilgrimage to Jerusalem, during which he perished in September of the year 1052 on the return journey. In the subsequent years, several earldoms fell vacant and were granted to Harold's younger brothers, further consolidating the family's power. In the year 1055, Siward, the Earl of Northumbria, died and was succeeded by Harold's younger sibling Tostig. Then in the year 1057, the Earl of Mercia passed away and was succeeded by his son Elfgar, which again freed up East Anglia. A reduced form of this earldom was granted to another one of Harold's brothers, Gurth, while the counties in Essex, Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Middlesex, Surrey and Kent were amalgamated into a new earldom for another of Harold's younger brothers, Leofwine. Thus, under the reign of King Edward the Confessor, the Godwin family came to dominate nearly all of England, with the exception of Mercia. By this time, King Edward was largely content to leave the effective rule of the kingdom in the capable hands of his powerful earls, which were mainly the Godwinsons. In the year 1063, Harold Godwinson embarked on a bold and bloody campaign against Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, the formidable ruler who had dominated Wales since the year 1055. The Welsh king had unified the territories and presented a significant challenge to the ambitions of Harold and his kin. With the scent of conquest in the air, Harold launched a daring cavalry raid deep into Welsh territory. The objective was clear and brutal: to eliminate the King of Wales and dismantle his grip on power. Yet, despite the ferocity and swiftness of the attack, the mission faltered, and the enemy king remained unscathed, his rule unbroken. Undeterred by this initial setback, Harold regrouped and prepared for a more comprehensive assault. Later that same year, he joined forces with his brother Tostig, the Earl of Northumbria, forging a powerful alliance, aiming at bringing the Welsh king to his knees. This time, the invasion was meticulously planned, combining both land and naval forces in a coordinated strike designed to lay waste into the Welsh heartlands. The brothers led their armies with a relentless and ruthless determination, advancing through the rugged terrain, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. Villages were razed, crops were burned, and the once vibrant landscape was stained with blood. The sheer brutality and relentless pressure of Harold and Tostig's forces began to take its toll. The Welsh king's own men, weary and demoralised by the onslaught, saw the futility of resistance against such overwhelming might. The desolation wrought by the invading forces had sown the seeds of discontent and despair within the ranks of the Welsh defenders. In a desperate bid to save themselves from further annihilation, the Welsh king's own men turned against him. Betrayal seethed through the ranks, and in a grim act of treachery, the Welsh killed their own king, severing his head. The decapitated head of the Welsh king was then sent to Harold as an offering, representing the devastating effectiveness of his campaign. This brutal act not only eliminated a significant threat, but also cemented Harold's reputation as a fearsome and decisive military leader. Thus, Harold now had Wales under his influence, and was now undisputedly the most powerful Earl in all of England, taking the mantle of his late father Godwin. In the year 1064, Harold found himself shipwrecked at Ponthieu, an event shrouded in speculation and mystery. According to the earliest post-conquest Norman chroniclers, King Edward had previously dispatched Robert of Jumièges, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to appoint Duke William of Normandy, Edward's maternal kinsman, as his heir. They assert Harold's later voyage was intended to swear fealty to William. However, scholars debate the reliability of this narrative. While William seemingly believed he had been promised the succession, certain actions of King Edward, such as his efforts to bring his nephew Edward the Exile, the son of King Edmund Ironside, back from Hungary in the year 1057, contradict this claim. Later Norman chroniclers propose alternate reasons for Harold's journey. Some suggest he was seeking the release of his youngest brother Wulfnoth, who had long been held hostage in Normandy, while others speculate that Harold was driven across the Channel by an unexpected storm. There is a general consensus that Harold was blown off course, ultimately landing at Ponthieu. Captured by Guy, the Count of Ponthieu, Harold was taken hostage at the Count's castle. William soon arrived and demanded that Guy hand over Harold. William now had England's wealthiest Earl imprisoned, but knowing Harold's worth, the two powerful men no doubt had a negotiation that has been long forgotten to history. Following his capture, Harold accompanied William in a campaign against William's adversary, Conan II, the Duke of Brittany. During this campaign, while traversing the treacherous terrain near the fortified abbey of Mont Saint-Michel, Harold is noted for heroically rescuing two of William's soldiers from quicksand. It is said that William presented Harold with weapons and arms, bestowing a knighthood upon him. The Bayeux tapestry and other Norman sources depict Harold swearing an oath on sacred relics to support William's claim to the English throne. This oath, whether coerced or given willingly, would later be used by William to justify his invasion of England, setting the stage for one of the most significant conflicts in English history. Tostig's tenure as the Earl of Northumbria was a tale of contrasts. In external affairs, he achieved notable success, forging a friendship with the King of Scotland that largely secured his northern borders from trouble. He also led a delegation to Rome on behalf of King Edward, enhancing his standing in the broader realm, and helped his brother Harold in his campaigns in Wales. However, within his own earldom, Tostig's stringent measures to maintain the king's peace rendered him deeply unpopular among his nobles. In the year 1065, while Tostig was attending King Edward's court in southern England, his discontented nobles rose in revolt. They murdered his men and demanded his banishment. Harold, seeking to avoid the outbreak of civil war, refused to march to Northumbria to reinstate his brother. Faced with the rebels' demands and Harold's reluctance, King Edward agreed to exile Tostig. Tostig departed for Flanders. There, he sought to garner support from powerful allies, visiting William of Normandy, King Sweyn II of Denmark, and ultimately Harald Hardrada of Norway. He aimed to find partners who could help him reclaim his earldom and power. Meanwhile, the earldom of Northumbria was granted to Morcar, the brother of Earl Edwin of Mercia. To solidify his own position and strengthen alliances, Harold married their sister Ealdgith, thereby aligning himself with the influential Mercian brothers. Prior to the reign of King Edward the Confessor, in the 11th century, the English throne had been under Viking influence after the conquest of England by Sweyn Forkbeard and his son Cnut the Great. Once the throne came back into the possession of the Saxon line, its power was much diminished. Edward the Confessor would be remembered as a politically weak king, whose death brought about one of the most famous succession crises in history. At the end of the year 1065, Edward the Confessor fell into a coma, without clarifying his preference for the succession. He died on the 5th of January in the year 1066. He briefly regained consciousness and entrusted the kingdom to Harold's protection. Upon Edward's death, several people claimed that they should be the next King of England. The claims to the throne of these men were based on blood ties, oaths, kinship, and links to earlier kings. Each claim to the throne was strong. Among the contenders for the English throne, there was Edgar the Atheling, the son of Edward the Exile. Edward the Exile, who had tragically died en route to the English court, would have been named heir by King Edward the Confessor. According to the structures of lineage, Edgar was the rightful heir, being a direct male descendant of Alfred the Great, and the grandson of Edmund Ironside, who perished after the brutal conflict with Cnut the Great. The recent years had seen the mysterious deaths and assassinations of many Ethelings, including Edward the Exile, thus making Edgar's claim to the throne one purely based on blood ties, as he had no lands, soldiers, or allies apart from the king himself, who was now dead. Standing in contrast was Harold Godwinson, the formidable head of the House of Godwin, and the Earl of Wessex. Wessex was the wealthiest and most powerful region in England, and Harold was also a prominent figure at court, renowned for his service to Edward the Confessor and his prowess in numerous battles. As England's most trusted military commander, his influence was unparalleled. Additionally, Harold's lineage was thought to trace back to Ethelred, the King of Wessex, and the elder brother of Alfred the Great. The crown had only passed to Alfred's direct line because Ethelred's son was deemed too young to rule during the dire threat posed by the great heathen army in the 9th century. In Norway, Harald Hardrada also laid claim to the English throne. According to his assertion, Edward the Confessor had usurped the rightful place of Hardrada's nephew, King Magnus the Good. Magnus had been named heir to the Danish throne by King Harthacnut through a binding agreement, and Magnus believed that this accord extended to the English throne as well. Edward had seized the throne before Magnus, who subsequently died childless. Harald Hardrada, who had been co-king of Norway alongside Magnus, became the sole monarch upon Magnus's death. Now Hardrada saw himself as the rightful heir to the English crown, viewing it as his inheritance, with Edward, the usurper of Magnus, now being deceased. Another formidable contender for the throne was William, the Duke of Normandy. He claimed that Edward had not only designated him as the next king, but that Harold Godwinson had sworn a sacred oath to support William's claim. Moreover, the relationship between England and Normandy provided additional weight to his claim. Emma of Normandy was William's great aunt, and Edward had spent a significant part of his early life in exile at the Norman court. Thus, the throne of England was contested by 4 formidable men. There was Harold Hardrada, asserting his perceived rightful inheritance; William of Normandy, fortified by promises and familial connections; Harold Godwinson, the trusted military leader of Wessex, a man whose lineage also whispered of ancient kings; and Edgar Atheling, the legitimate heir by blood, yet a mere boy, powerless and without allies. This clash of claims, rooted in ambition, lineage, and allegiance, set the stage for a dramatic struggle over the English crown. The day after Edward the Confessor's death, there was a meeting of the Witan to decide who should become the next King of England. The Witan was made up of a group of many lords and bishops, and they considered the merits of the main 4 candidates. But the whole principle of succession had been turned upside down by the interlude of Viking kings, and the Witan no longer felt itself bound to choose a king belonging to the line of Alfred, when it was obvious that a strong man was needed on the throne, and Edgar the Atheling was a mere boy. Whatever promises Edward the Confessor may have made to William, he undoubtedly himself nominated Harold as his successor. The day after Edward's death, Harold was unanimously elected by the Witan and was crowned by the Archbishop of York. But Harold didn't have time to enjoy his new status as king, as 2 invasion forces would soon arrive on his shores. Harold Godwinson's younger brother Tostig was known for his formidable military prowess. However, he was exiled for defying the laws of the land, and harboured a deep resentment towards his brother, who was now the King of England. In his bitterness, Tostig reached out to King Harold Hardrada of Norway and persuaded him to invade England. One of the sagas recounts that Tostig sailed to Norway and greatly impressed the Norwegian king and his court. Despite having only recently concluded a long and inconclusive war with Denmark, the initially reluctant Hardrada was swayed by Tostig's persuasion and agreed to raise an army to claim the throne of England. Harold Hardrada, a towering figure in the Viking Age, was renowned for his formidable character and unparalleled war attributes. His name Hardrada, meaning hard ruler, reflects his stern and unyielding nature. Harold's extensive military career spanned several decades and regions, including battles in Norway, Denmark, and the Byzantine Empire. His combat experience made him a seasoned and battle-hardened warrior. In September of the year 1066, Hardrada embarked on his voyage to England. He made a stop in Orkney to gather essential supplies and more men, and soon after was reinforced by the traitor Tostig Godwinson, who joined him with additional soldiers and supplies. Hardrada soon arrived in England with the full might of Norway, bolstered by Tostig and Scottish forces. His fierce gaze set upon the unprepared coast. His army descended like wolves, plundering and burning like the Vikings of old. When they reached Scarborough in Northumbria, the locals mustered a brave but futile resistance. Without a moment's hesitation, the Vikings unleashed a storm of fire and fury, reducing the town to smouldering ruins. The flames licked the sky, sending a clear message to other towns, which swiftly chose surrender over annihilation. The news of the Northmen's arrival quickly reached Earl Morcar of Northumbria and Earl Edwin of Mercia. Determined to protect their lands, they assembled a formidable army and confronted Hardrada. So swift was the Northmen's arrival in England that the English earls did not have time to send word to Harold Godwinson, their king, but instead chose to fight the Norse invasion rather than submit. This would result in the Battle of Fulford. The battle began with a thunderous charge as the English struck first, hoping to catch the Norwegians unprepared. Morcar's troops surged forward, driving Hardrada's men back into the treacherous marshlands, but the seasoned Viking king, unflinching amidst the chaos, rallied his warriors. Reinforcements from the right flank crashed into the English centre, their fierce battle cries echoing through the marsh. Despite being outnumbered, the Viking invaders fought with a berserker fury, forcing the Anglo-Saxons to yield ground. As more Viking warriors joined the fray, they cunningly manoeuvred around the thick of the battle, opening a third front. The Anglo-Saxons, now outflanked and overwhelmed, faced a relentless onslaught. Blood soaked the earth, and the air was filled with the screams of the dying. The English forces, unable to withstand the brutal assault, crumbled and were decimated, with the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria retreating. The Viking losses were minimal and were less than 1,000 men. With York's surrender to Harold Hardrada, the victorious Norsemen retired to Stamford Bridge, 7 miles east of York, to await the arrival of hostages and consolidate their grip on a land they had so violently claimed. Harold Godwinson soon learned of the Viking invasion, and with relentless urgency, mustered as many earls, lords and warriors as he could gather. They travelled day and night, racing from London to York, a grueling journey of 200 miles, accomplished in a mere 4 days. This swift manoeuvre granted Harold the element of surprise, as Hardrada and his Viking horde remained blissfully unaware of the English king's proximity, until they physically saw the Anglo-Saxon army bearing down upon them. As the dawn of battle approached, a lone figure rode forth from the mist-shrouded ranks of the Saxons, a harbinger of death and defiance, his identity concealed beneath a black cloak. He approached Harold Hardrada and Tostig with a chilling proposition. No name escaped his lips, but his words cut through the cold morning air like a blade. To Tostig, he offered the return of his lost earldom if he would betray Hardrada. In response, Tostig, ever the opportunist, demanded to know what his brother the English king would offer in return for such treachery. The rider's reply was a grim prophecy, wrapped in the cloak of a challenge. 7 feet of English ground, for he is taller than other men. With these words, the rider vanished back into the swirling mists, leaving behind a stunned silence among the Norsemen. Hardrada, known for his warrior's heart, was struck by the audacity of the message. Turning to Tostig, he demanded to know the identity of the fearless messenger. Tostig's reply fell like a stone into a pool of silence. He said it was Harold Godwinson, the King of England himself. Swiftly after this meeting, the English army descended upon the Norwegians with a fury and would begin to massacre Hardrada's forces. Caught off guard and by surprise, the Norse warriors scrambled to meet the sudden onslaught. The advance of the English was momentarily stalled by the narrow passage of a bridge. It was here where a lone Norwegian warrior armed with a Dane axe and driven by a berserker fury would hold off the entirety of the English army. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though this Norseman might defy the march of the English, but fate intervened. After the berserker had slain 40 Englishmen, an English soldier unseen beneath the bridge thrust his spear upward through the wooden planks, finding its mark in the groin of the berserk, bringing him to his knees, allowing him to be slain. Godwinson's army would then surge across the bridge, a relentless tide of warriors locked shields, and charged. They formed a formidable line just short of the Norse army, their collective roar echoing across the battlefield. The battle quickly spread far beyond the confines of the bridge, transforming the landscape into an area of death and valour. For hours the clash raged on, steel meeting steel. The Norsemen and their decision to forsake their armour proved to be a fatal misstep, as they found themselves increasingly at a disadvantage. The English forces, relentless and unyielding, pressed their attack with ferocity. Slowly but surely, they fragmented the once impenetrable Norse shield wall, exploiting every weakness until it shattered. Tostig Godwinson, the traitor to the English, was slain in the carnage, as were many Norse earls and formidable warriors. In the heart of this chaos, Harald Hardrada stood as a beacon of raw power. His hands gripped his longsword with unwavering strength, carving a path through the enemy with each swing. It is said that he entered the legendary state of the Berserker, his fury transcending human limits. In this trance-like rage, the 50-year-old veteran of 100 battles became a whirlwind of death, felling foe after foe with savage precision, a god on the battlefield. According to Harald's saga, this is what transpired. King Harald Sigurdsson saw this. He went into the fray where the greatest crash of weapons was, and there was a sharp conflict, in which many people fell on both sides. King Harald then was in a rage, and ran out in front of the array, and hewed down with both hands, so that neither helmet nor armour could withstand him, and all who were nearest gave way before him. It was then very near with the English that they had taken to flight. King Harald Sigurdsson was hit by an arrow in the windpipe, and that was his death wound. The Icelandic historian and poet Snorri Sturluson also wrote of Harald's death. The Saxons ran away from him. An arrow hit him in the chin, but he pulled it out. Another arrow hit him in the throat. Then he sat down. A friend asked him if he was hurt. Harald said, "It's just a small arrow, but it's doing its job." And then he died. Godwinson had now proved himself to be a brilliant strategist and commander, and would cement his name in history by defeating the legendary warrior and king Harald Hardrada, ending the Viking Age and killing the last great Viking warrior king. However, to the south, another claimant had landed on the English shores. William, the Duke of Normandy, had come for his crown, and as the English King Harold was fighting in the north, William was sailing across the Channel, with his aim being conquest and the forging of a new dynasty. William, the Duke of Normandy, sought divine approval for his invasion, securing the blessing of Pope Alexander II. But divine favour was not enough for the Duke. He also secured earthly alliances, weaving a web of political support from the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV and King Sweyn II of Denmark. With his forces emboldened by divine and mortal alliances, William's fleet crossed the Channel on the fateful eve of September the 28th in the year 1066. Meanwhile, in the aftermath of the savage clash at Stamford Bridge, Harold Godwinson, blood-soaked and battle-worn, was forced to pivot southward with frantic urgency to face the looming threat of the Norman invaders. Seizing the fleeting moments, William and his war-hardened companions constructed a fortress at Hastings, a bastion of wood and iron, meant to shield the Norman horde from the impending storm of English fury. With the rising sun on October the 14th of the year 1066, the fields of Hastings beheld a convergence of two formidable forces. William, leading the Normans, renowned for their formidable armour and Viking lineage, faced off against Harold Godwinson, commanding the full strength of the English army. William divided his force into 3 groups: archers, foot soldiers, and cavalry. He placed foot soldiers armed with arrows and crossbows in the front line, foot soldiers in the second and in the rear squadrons of cavalry, and William took his place in the midst of them with the elite. From there, he was able to direct all sides using both his voice and gestures. As Harold's forces stealthily approached through the vales of the woodland, they ascended to the top of a commanding hill. From this vantage point, they launched a relentless barrage upon any Norman soldiers daring to ascend, hurling javelins with deadly accuracy before descending into brutal close quarters combat. The English, forming a formidable shield wall, mustered their defences with shields tightly interlocked, presenting an impenetrable barrier against enemy assault. The clash commenced with Norman archers unleashing their deadly volleys uphill, only to find their arrows futile against the steadfast English shield wall. As Norman spearmen advanced into melee combat, they were met by a relentless storm of javelins, each strike further diminishing their ranks. Despite the Normans' valour, William's soldiers found themselves unable to breach the unyielding Saxon defence. In a desperate bid to turn the tide, Norman cavalry surged forward, only to meet the same fate against the impenetrable shield wall. Yet, despite the gruelling exhaustion, the English army, emboldened by their recent victory over Harold Hardrada in the north, surged forth with unyielding determination. As blood flowed down the hillside, the relentless spirit of the English warriors drove the Normans back, reflecting their stamina, courage, and how formidable the English army was behind the warrior king, Harold Godwinson. As the Normans grappled with the steadfast resolve of Harold's soldiers entrenched upon the hill, they suffered grievous losses, causing the tide of the battle to sway in the favour of the Anglo-Saxons. This would result in a widespread retreat among the Norman ranks. Amidst the chaos, a rumour spread through the battlefield that Duke William himself had fallen in the fray. Seizing upon this moment of uncertainty, some Norman troops hastily retreated towards the sea, pursued by the advancing English, who finally relinquished their advantageous position atop the slope. Observing the disarray among his own forces, William, undeterred and resolute, cast aside his helmet, revealing his face. As he galloped through his retreating forces, he rallied his men with loud cries. Despite the brush with defeat, the Norman horsemen regrouped and surged back to the front lines. William then spearheaded a counterattack against the oncoming English onslaught. In the chaos of the battle, the English swiftly reformed their impregnable shield wall, bracing themselves for a renewed clash of arms. As the battle unfolded, its ferocity intensified with each pressing hour. The Normans, fueled by desperation, launched a final determined assault to seize control of the ridge. Amidst the relentless clash of steel, the toll of war became painfully evident. Numerous Saxon lords, valiant in their defence, met their demise upon the battlefield. Among the fallen were 2 of King Harold Godwinson's own brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, with one story telling of how the Duke himself slew Gurth, mistaking him for Harold. Undeterred by the devastating losses, King Harold himself emerged as a formidable presence amidst the fray, his sword flashing with deadly precision as he felled foe after foe in the relentless carnage of the battle. The battle would seem to never end, and it is reported that William had 2 to 3 horses killed under him and somehow still fought on, his body battered and injured from the falls. Nevertheless, due to the superiority in the Norman-French mixed cavalry and infantry tactics over the Germanic-Scandinavian traditional shield wall, William managed to breach the English defences, and in the melee that ensued, would overwhelm Harold's forces. Harold would fight until the bitter end, in the thick of the carnage, reminiscent of the Saxon kings of old. But fortune did not favour him at Hastings, and so Harold Godwinson, the king who had just ended the Viking Age, had conquered Wales, and had just forged his new dynasty of the House of Godwin, was slain there on the battlefield. According to one account, Harold was hacked to death at the hands of 4 Norman knights in graphic detail. The first, cleaving his breast through the shield with his point, drenched the earth with a gushing torrent of blood. The second smote off his head below the protection of the helmet, and the third pierced the inwards of his belly with his lance. The fourth hewed off his thigh and bore away the severed limb. The details surrounding the demise of King Harold at the Battle of Hastings are shrouded in a veil of ambiguity, as conflicting accounts and varied interpretations vie for prominence. Among these, the Chronicles of William of Malmesbury offer a vivid portrayal, attributing Harold's tragic end to an arrow that found its mark piercing his eye and lodging deep within his brain. Regardless of the intricacies of the accounts, historians concur on one pivotal fact: Harold met his end at the end of the battle, and fought until the bitter end. Tostig Godwinson was an Anglo-Saxon nobleman, Earl of Northumbria, and the brother of King Harold Godwinson. In the Norse kings' sagas, he is remembered as a clever man and a formidable warrior. In addition, in the writing of an anonymous life of King Edward the Confessor, Tostig is described as strong, brave, handsome, graceful, and open-handed. Both descriptions of him in Norse and Anglo-Saxon sources paint him as a great man and warrior. Many historians view Tostig's exile from England as the spark that ignited 2 of the most pivotal invasions in British history: Harold Hardrada's Norse assault and William the Duke of Normandy's legendary conquest. These events would culminate in the fall of Anglo-Saxon England and unleash a series of brutal, bloody battles. This is his story. Tostig was the 3rd son of Godwin, the Earl of Wessex, a man whose rise to power was nothing short of meteoric during the reign of Cnut the Great, the King of England, Denmark, and Norway. Though destined for greatness, the family's legacy was born from shadows. Tostig's grandfather, Wulfnoth Sild, a Thegn of Sussex, had been accused of treachery by King Ethelred the Unready, casting a long stain over the Godwin family name. Godwin, Tostig's father, thus rose from a position of disgrace, his early life marked by the burden of suspicion and political exile. Yet, Godwin's fortunes changed dramatically. He served King Edmund Ironside loyally during the bitter struggle for the English throne against Cnut. When peace was eventually struck between the 2 monarchs, and Edmund died shortly thereafter, Cnut, recognising Godwin's loyalty and martial prowess, elevated him to the position of the Earl of Wessex. From that moment, Godwin became one of the most influential men in England. He strengthened his political stature further through marriage to Gytha Thorkelsdottir, a Danish noblewoman of illustrious heritage. Gytha was the daughter of Thorgil Sprakleg, a Danish chieftain who, according to some historians, was the son of the legendary Viking warrior Styrbjorn the Strong, the Prince of Sweden. Styrbjorn was said to be the son of King Olaf Bjornsson of Sweden, making Tostig a direct descendant and great-great-grandson of Swedish royalty. On his father's side, Tostig may have also held royal English blood. Some reconstructions of his ancestry suggest that Earl Godwin descended from King Ethelred I of Wessex, the elder brother to Alfred the Great. During the tumultuous time of the Viking invasions and the threat posed by the Great Heathen Army and the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ethelred I's untimely death from battle wounds led to the crown passing to Alfred, as Ethelred's own sons were too young to rule. If both of these lineages, the Danish and the English, are to be believed, then Tostig Godwinson could rightly claim royal blood on both sides of his family, descended from kings of both Saxon and Scandinavian realms. Tostig was born in the year 1029, during the reign of Cnut the Great, at a time when England was an Anglo-Scandinavian kingdom, a realm shaped by both Danish and Saxon traditions. As the son of Godwin, the Earl of Wessex, Tostig would have enjoyed one of the finest upbringings available in such a society, nurtured in a world that valued strength, loyalty, and statesmanship. From an early age, he would have been trained in the arts of war and governance, prepared for a life of power and responsibility. In the year 1035, when Tostig was still a young child, King Cnut died, and the English crown passed to his son Harold Harefoot. Harold reigned for 5 years before his own death in the year 1040. The throne then passed to his half-brother Harthacnut, who ruled for a brief 2 years before meeting an untimely end, poisoned at a wedding feast in the year 1042. Tostig's formative years unfolded under the shadow of the Viking kings of England, a time of shifting power and fragile peace. When Harthacnut died, he was succeeded by Edward the Confessor, returning the English crown to its Anglo-Saxon roots. By the time Tostig reached the age of 13, he had already witnessed the deaths of 3 English kings and the coronation of a 4th. Tostig's father Godwin carefully secured his family's influence at court by allying with the new king, Edward the Confessor. He arranged the marriage of his daughter Edith to the king, making Edward Tostig's brother-in-law. Meanwhile, Godwin's sons were rising in prominence. Sweyn, the eldest, was granted an earldom covering Somerset, Gloucestershire, and Hertfordshire. Harold received East Anglia, and Godwin himself retained control of Wessex, with only Mercia and Northumbria beyond their reach. The Godwins now held sway over much of England. However, tensions soon emerged. Edward, raised in exile in Normandy during the Viking rule, began introducing Norman customs and courtiers to English governance. As a half-Norman outsider with little experience in English politics, his efforts clashed with the entrenched power of the Godwins, setting the stage for conflict. The crisis came in the year 1051. Godwin raised an army, while the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria rallied to their king. Neither side wished to strike first, and the standoff ended with a meeting of the Witan, where Godwin's faction, outnumbered, were forced into exile. Godwin, his wife, and sons Sweyn, Tostig, and Gurth fled to Flanders. Harold and Leofwine to Ireland, and Queen Edith was sent to a nunnery. On an unknown date before September of the year 1051, Tostig married Judith of Flanders, the daughter of Baldwin IV. The exile of the Godwin clan was short-lived. In the year 1052, Godwin and his sons returned with fleets and mercenaries. Godwin rallied the support of his old vassals in Sussex and Kent, and then sailed on London. The king, unable to resist the formidable army, was forced to restore their titles and lands. Edith, the queen, returned to court, and many of Edward's Norman favourites were expelled. So complete was Godwin's restoration to power that Edward never again challenged him. Yet, the triumph was fleeting. In the year 1053, while celebrating Easter in Winchester with the king and his sons, Godwin suddenly collapsed and died. The earldom of Wessex would pass to Tostig's brother Harold, as Sweyn at this time had died while on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Over the next few years, one earldom after another fell vacant, and was granted to Harold Godwinson's various younger brothers. First, Siward, the Earl of Northumbria, died in the year 1055, and was succeeded by Tostig. Then in the year 1057, the Earl of Mercia died, and was succeeded by his son Elfgar, freeing up the earldom of East Anglia. A reduced form of this earldom was bestowed upon Gurth, while the counties of Essex, Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Middlesex, Surrey and Kent were formed into a new earldom for Leofwine. The Godwin family thus held the whole of England, apart from Mercia under the kingship of Edward the Confessor, who was by now largely content to leave effective rule to his earls. When Tostig assumed his new role, he was likely still in his mid-20s, and the challenges before him were immense. Northumbria was a wild and unsettled land, ravaged by feuds, marked by lawlessness, and far removed from his native Wessex. Its powerful lords may well have resented the appointment of a southern noble to govern them, but Tostig's Danish heritage, with his mother being of Danish descent, may have afforded him some insight into the region's unique culture, where Anglo-Saxon, Danish and Norse traditions mingled. One of the most pressing threats he faced was the defence of Northumbria against the incursions of Malcolm Canmore, King of the Scots. Malcolm began with a series of violent cross-border raids, but Tostig, favouring diplomacy over conflict, succeeded in negotiating a peace. This culminated in an oath of brotherhood between the two men, symbolising a bond of mutual respect and alliance. Securing this peace, Tostig felt increasingly free to now leave his earldom, at times to attend the royal court, at others to oversee his personal estates. He even joined his brother Harold in a military campaign against Wales, demonstrating both his ambition and growing involvement in the affairs of the wider realm. Llewellyn ap Gruffydd was the only Welsh king to unite all of Wales, ruling from the year 1055 to 1063. He reached an agreement with Edward the Confessor, but the death of his ally Elfgar, the Earl of Mercia, in the year 1062 left him and the Welsh vulnerable. In late 1062, Harold Godwinson led a bold campaign deep into Wales. Llewellyn ap Gruffydd was nearly captured, but was warned in time to escape out onto the sea into his ships, though his other ships were destroyed. In the spring of the year 1063, Harold's brother Tostig led an army into North Wales, while Harold led the fleet first to South Wales and then north to meet his brother's army. The Welsh king was forced to take refuge in Snowdonia, where he met his death, but he was betrayed by his men, and his head was sent to Harold. After his death, Wales was again divided into separate kingdoms, with Tostig being instrumental in the subjugation of Wales. In the year 1061, Tostig participated in the important English embassy to Rome, a delegation sent by King Edward the Confessor to Pope Nicholas II to address various affairs regarding the Church. Accompanying the bishops on this sacred mission, Tostig provided protection with his retinue of housecarls, elite warriors of Danish and Norse descent, who served as his personal guard. These seasoned fighters, known for their discipline and prowess, were considered among the finest soldiers in all of Europe. At Easter, Pope Nicholas II convened a synod in Rome, which both Tostig and Archbishop Ealdred attended. Such was Tostig's stature that he was reportedly granted a seat beside the Pope himself, a rare honour that underscored his standing. The mission concluded successfully, and the delegation returned to England having accomplished nearly all of its goals. During Tostig's frequent absences, Northumbria was ably governed by his deputy Cosby, a respected local magnate. Yet, despite Cosby's capable stewardship, unrest began to simmer among the Northumbrians. A central source of tension was Tostig's imposition of a tribute, widely regarded by the local thanes as both excessive and unjust. This may have been a calculated attempt to raise the region's historically low taxes to levels more consistent with those earldoms in England, or perhaps a means of covering Tostig's own expenses, particularly those incurred during his campaigns in Wales. As was customary, 1/3 of these levies remained in the Earl's coffers rather than the King's. Tostig's standing suffered further blows. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle accuses him of having robbed God. This is difficult to interpret, especially given his reputation for piety and generosity toward the church. His administration of justice in this notoriously unruly province also caused friction. Tostig would try to restore order using harsh methods, such as executions, mutilations, and the confiscation of property from robbers. This was viewed by many not as justice, but as cruelty. Some even accused him of profiting from these punishments, suggesting personal gain. In his efforts to curb the deeply entrenched Northumbrian tradition of blood feuds, Tostig may have attempted to impose legal codes from Wessex, but these southern reforms only deepened the alienation of the local nobility. Relations between Tostig and the discontented thanes reached a breaking point in around the year 1063 or 1064, when two nobles, Gamel the son of Orm and Ulf the son of Dulfin, were murdered under his hospitality and protection. A third, Gospatric son of Uhtred, was likewise slain at Christmas the following year. These assassinations destroyed any remaining hope of reconciliation. Tostig had been entangled in the very blood feuds he sought to end, with many of Northumbria's leading families now openly wishing him dead. The long-brewing resentment broke out on the 3rd of October in the year 1065, while Tostig was hunting in the south with his brother-in-law King Edward the Confessor. A force of 200 men entered York, backed by the city's citizens. They stormed Tostig's residence, killed 2 of his housecarls, and seized control. The next day, around 200 of his supporters were massacred, his treasury still heavy with silver and gold collected by his reeves was looted. All the thanes of York rose in rebellion. These thanes, second to ealdormen in rank, now stood united against their Earl. The rebels declared Tostig an outlaw and proclaimed Morcar, the brother of Edwin the Earl of Mercia, as the new Earl of Northumbria. Though native candidates such as Wulftheof, son of the former Earl Siward, were available, the choice of Morcar was strategic. It ensured Mercian support. Should Harold Godwinson, Tostig's powerful brother and the Earl of Wessex, attempt to restore him by force. Morcar and Edwin, young sons of the recently deceased Elfgar of Mercia, had long been rivals to Tostig. Their rise now seemed the culmination of years of political hostility. As the rebellion gathered momentum, the Northumbrians marched south, rallying support from the surrounding shires. Those suspected of loyalty to Tostig were hunted down and slain, whether in York, Lincoln, or the villages, fields and waterways of the countryside. By the time the rebels reached Northampton, they had been joined by Earl Edwin himself, commanding a substantial Mercian force, bolstered by Welsh contingents, no friends to the Godwinsons. Northumbria, parts of Mercia, and allied Welsh forces were now in open rebellion. King Edward the Confessor responded to the revolt by summoning his councillors to Oxford, where he began to make preparations for a march north to confront the rebels. Harold, the Earl of Wessex, who was now the king's most trusted advisor, was dispatched to negotiate with the Northerners. The rebels remained defiant, urging Harold to persuade the king to accept their choice of Morcar as the new Earl of Northumbria. While Harold journeyed south to inform the king, the rebels unleashed destruction upon the region surrounding Northampton. Many were slain, others were taken prisoner, and entire settlements were left in ruins, their barns and houses consumed by fire. In an effort to restore peace, the king sent messengers northward, offering to address any legitimate grievances, provided the rebels ceased their devastation. But the Northumbrians refused to yield and offered a stark ultimatum. Tostig must first be deposed and sent into exile. Only then would they lay down their arms. Furious, King Edward summoned the Fjord, his national army. But no army came. Though the unusually harsh winter was cited as the reason for the delay, the truth was plain. Few were willing to plunge the kingdom into civil war. When even his most loyal nobles refused to obey his summons, and when Harold himself urged the king to relinquish his support for Tostig, Edward recognized the bitter truth. He had no choice but to yield. Tostig was summoned before the Witan, the king's council, and was commanded to relinquish his position as the Earl of Northumbria, but he refused. His defiance left the council no alternative. Tostig was declared an outlaw. During the royal council, Tostig openly accused his brother of conspiring with the rebels and betraying him. Whether out of wounded pride, anger, or the bitter sting of abandonment, Tostig believed Harold had turned against him when he needed him most. Although Harold swore an oath that he had not been involved in the rebellion, Tostig remained defiant. Once brothers in arms, who had grown up side by side and fought shoulder to shoulder in the Welsh campaigns, Tostig and Harold were now divided by politics, ambition, and distrust. What had once been a bond of loyalty was now bitter enmity. Such was the sorrow of King Edward at the banishment of his brother-in-law Tostig, and the refusal of his subjects to obey his royal will, that he reportedly fell into deep distress. This anguish, coupled with his advancing age, gave way to a decline in health. With Edward's passing, the throne would go to his chosen successor, Harold Godwinson. Tostig's brother Harold was crowned as the King of England, despite the presence of 3 other rival claimants. The first was Edgar Atheling, the last male heir of the royal line of Alfred the Great. Edgar was only 14 years old, and lacked both military strength and political allies, rendering his claim more symbolic than serious. The second was William, the Duke of Normandy. William asserted that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier, and that Harold himself had sworn a solemn oath to support that claim. Further bolstering William's position was his bloodline. His aunt, Emma of Normandy, had once been the Queen of England, mother to both Edward the Confessor and Harthacnut. The third claimant was Harald Hardrada, the formidable King of Norway. He based his claim on an agreement forged years earlier between his predecessor Magnus the Good and Harthacnut, Edward's predecessor on the English throne. The 2 rulers had sworn a mutual oath that whichever of them died first, the other would inherit all of their realms. Upon Harthacnut's death, Magnus indeed claimed Denmark, but Edward had swiftly been crowned in England. Magnus even went so far as to send Edward a letter threatening invasion, an invasion that never materialized. Nevertheless, Hardrada believed that England had been usurped from Magnus, and that with Edward now dead, the English crown was rightfully his. The Witan, England's council of nobles and elders, weighed the competing claims, but in the end, it was Edward's deathbed declaration that swayed them. The dying king had entrusted the kingdom's protection to Harold Godwinson, who stood not only as England's most powerful Earl, but also a seasoned military commander and the man best equipped to defend the realm. And so, with the Witans' vote, Harold was crowned king, setting the stage for one of the most tumultuous years in English history. There can be little doubt that upon hearing of his brother Harold's ascent to the English throne, Tostig's fury deepened. Consumed by anger and resentment, he sought refuge with his brother-in-law Baldwin V, the Count of Flanders. Baldwin welcomed Tostig, his family and household into his court, appointing him as his deputy and granting him both the revenues of the port and the support of Flemish knights. In Flanders, Tostig quickly gathered a sizable force of mercenaries who were drawn by promises of plunder and power. The details of Tostig's movements over the following months remain somewhat obscure, but reports suggest he travelled across the courts of Europe, seeking support for his return to power. He is believed to have visited William, the Duke of Normandy, and Sweyn Estridsson, the King of Denmark, urging them both to join him in launching an invasion of England to reclaim his lost earldom of Northumbria. But for both William and Sweyn, the moment was not yet opportune. Undeterred, Tostig secured a fleet from Baldwin and set sail for England. He landed on the Isle of Wight in May of the year 1066, gathering provisions and levying tribute. His forces raided the southern coast as far as Sandwich, but their advance was halted when King Harold swiftly mobilized both land and naval forces to repel the incursion. Tostig then turned northward. He attempted, without success, to win over his younger brother Gurth to his cause. Thwarted again, he launched fresh raids into Norfolk and Lincolnshire, but this time the resistance was swift and decisive. The northern earls Edwin and Morcar confronted him in battle and dealt him a crushing defeat. As his forces crumbled and his men deserted him, Tostig was forced to flee. Seeking refuge once more, he made his way to the court of King Malcolm III of Scotland. It was there in the Scottish kingdom that Tostig spent the summer of 1066 waiting, watching, and preparing for one final attempt to reclaim what he had lost. Tostig then journeyed to Norway, where he sought an audience with King Harald Hardrada. According to the Norse sagas, Tostig recounted in full all that had transpired since his exile from England, and pleaded for Harold's support in reclaiming his lost earldom. At first, the king was hesitant. "The Norsemen have little appetite for war in England," he said, "nor do they care to be ruled by English lords. Besides, people say the English are not to be trusted." Tostig replied with a pointed question. "Is it true what I've heard in England, that your kinsman King Magnus once sent envoys to King Edward, claiming a right to the English crown as well as to Denmark, through an agreement made with Harthacnut?" "If that were true," Harold answered, "then why did he not claim the English throne?" To that Tostig responded sharply, "Why then do you not hold Denmark, as King Magnus once did?" The king retorted, "The Danes have little to boast over us Norsemen. We've burned many of their towns to ash, including lands belonging to your kin." But Tostig pressed on, "If you won't say it, then I will. Magnus conquered Denmark because its nobles stood with him. You failed to take it because the people stood against you. and Magnus didn't pursue England because the English firmly backed Edward as their king. But now the situation has changed. Will you not seize England? I can pave the way. With my help, many of the great nobles will support you. All that separates me from my standing equal with my brother Harold is a king's name. And all across the north, none deny your greatness in battle. You fought for 15 years to win Denmark, and now you hesitate to take England, which lies open before you. Harold listened carefully to Tostig's words. Much of what he said rang true, and the thought of adding England to his dominions stirred at the king's ambition. The two men spoke often and at length, until at last Harold resolved to act. He would launch an invasion that summer, with Tostig at his side. Harold sent a message across all Norway, summoning half the kingdom's fighting men to arms. As word spread, speculation swirled. Some recalled Harold's legendary conquests and believed he might indeed succeed. Others warned that England was not so easily taken. It was heavily fortified, its population vast, and so the stage was set. The winds of war stirred once more, and England would soon face its gravest threat in many years. Tostig was a valuable ally to King Harald Hardrada, not merely because he was the brother of Harold Godwinson, the man they sought to overthrow, but because he knew the land intimately. His knowledge of the terrain, the roads, and the loyalties of the northern lords made him an indispensable ally. In August of the year 1066, with the wind at their backs, Hardrada and Tostig crossed the broad sea and landed upon the coast of Yorkshire. They reached the mouth of the Humber River on the 18th of September, and wasting no time, led their forces inland towards the city of York. Just 2 days later, on the 20th of September, they were met at Fulford by the armies of Earls Edwin and Morcar. The English struck first, launching a bold offensive before the Norwegian army could properly form its lines. Morcar's troops surged forward, pressing the weaker segment of the Norse line back into the marshes. For a moment, it seemed the Anglo-Saxons might break through, but their early success quickly waned. The Norwegians rallied, bringing their strongest and freshest troops into the fray. Harold himself shifted forces from the right flank to reinforce the centre, while others were dispatched toward the river. Though the invaders were numerically inferior, they fought with brutal determination, pushing back the English line inch by inch. Edwin's men who were defending the riverbank suddenly found themselves isolated, cut off by the marshland from the rest of the army. Realizing they were vulnerable, they withdrew toward York, hoping to regroup for a last stand. But the Norwegians pressed on relentlessly. Meanwhile, fresh Norse reinforcements arrived, maneuvering around the main battle and opening a devastating third front against the Anglo-Saxons. Outnumbered, outflanked, and exhausted, the defenders were crushed. Edwin and Morcar narrowly escaped with their lives, but the power of Mercia and Northumbria had been shattered. At Fulford, the heart of northern England was torn open by the sword of Hardrada. Tostig fought in the battle with a fury, driven by vengeance against the Northumbrians and Mercians who had risen in rebellion and taken his earldom. For him, the battle was not merely political, it was deeply personal. Following the Norwegian victory, the city of York surrendered. The terms were merciful, perhaps at Tostig's urging, as he may not have wished to see his former capital plundered. The citizens opened their gates under the promise that no harm would come to them. Hostages were brought as a guarantee of peace, and with the city subdued, the Norwegian army withdrew to Stamford Bridge. unaware that a far greater storm was already gathering in the south. According to the Norse King saga, when Harold Godwinson's army swept northward with relentless speed, a group of 20 horsemen rode ahead to parley with Tostig. One of them stepped forward and called out, "Is Earl Tostig present in this host?" Tostig replied calmly, "It cannot be denied. You will find him here." Then the horseman said, "Your brother King Harold sends his greetings, and with them a message. He offers you the entire earldom of Northumbria once more, and if that alone is not enough to win your loyalty, he is willing to share with you 1/3 of the kingdom, to rule alongside him as his equal." Tostig answered, his voice heavy with bitter reflection, "This is a far cry from the scorn and enmity he showed me last winter. Had this offer been made then, many brave men would still be alive today, and perhaps England would not stand so divided. But tell me, if I accept these generous terms, what does Harold offer King Harold Sigurdsson, who has sailed so far and risked so much?" The horseman replied coldly, "He considered that as well, and promises him 7 feet of English soil or more, as he is taller than other men," implying that both Harold Hardrada and his army would be killed and buried on English soil. At this, Tostig's expression darkened, and he said, "Then ride back and tell King Harold to prepare for battle. Let it never be said that Earl Tostig abandoned Harold Sigurdsson to join his enemies when he crossed the sea to fight at my side. We have made our choice, to win England by the sword, or die with honour upon her soil." The horseman turned and rode back toward the advancing English army. When Tostig returned to the Norse lines, King Harold Sigurdsson asked, "Who was that man, the one who spoke with such poise and power?" Tostig replied, "That was my brother, King Harold Godwinson himself." King Harold narrowed his eyes. "That was concealed from me far too long. He came so close to our lines that he never should have returned alive." But Tostig replied solemnly, "It may have been unwise, as you say, for 2 such men to meet in such a way, but he came offering peace and a crown. Had I betrayed him then, I would have been his murderer. I would rather die at his hand than be the one to spill his blood, if one of us must fall." The sudden arrival of the entirety of the English army took the Norwegians by surprise. The Anglo-Saxon advance, however, was briefly hindered by the narrow bottleneck of Stamford Bridge itself. According to both the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the Chronicle of Henry of Huntingdon, a lone Norse warrior wielding a great Dane axe stationed himself at the heart of the crossing and held off the entirety of the English army. This brave delay gave the bulk of the Norse army time to assemble in a traditional shield wall formation to meet the oncoming assault. Once Harold Godwinson's forces had poured across the bridge, they quickly formed their own line, locked shields, and charged. The battle soon spilled beyond the bridge and raged across the surrounding fields. Though the fighting lasted for hours, the Norwegians were at a severe disadvantage. Many had left their armour behind, not expecting to face combat so soon after the surrender of York. Under the relentless English assault, the Norse line began to splinter. The once impenetrable shield wall broke apart, and the English forced their way through, cutting down the invaders from within. King Harold Hardrada himself was struck down by an arrow to the throat, and with his death, the tide turned irreversibly. According to the Norse sagas, Tostig took up the king's royal banner and continued the fight, determined to rally what remained of the army. But with their king dead and their lines broken, the spirit of the Norwegians faltered. The fighting had turned into a carnal bloodbath, and the Norwegians began to flee. Tostig, refusing to retreat, fell in the chaos, slain alongside the men he led to war. And so ended the battle at Stamford Bridge, a battle that would mark the end of the great Viking invasions of England. After his death at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Tostig's body was laid to rest in York. His sons, now orphaned and dispossessed, fled across the sea to Norway, seeking refuge in a foreign land. His widow, Edith of Flanders, eventually remarried, joining her fate to Duke Welf of Bavaria. Barely 19 days after his victory over Tostig and Harald Hardrada, King Harold Godwinson was once more called to arms. With his army still weary and bloodied from the northern campaign, he marched south to meet William of Normandy, and there on the fields near Hastings, he met defeat and death. Many historians have called Tostig's bitter feud with his brother the spark that shattered the Anglo-Saxon realm. The exile of Tostig and the loss of Northumbria from the Godwin family's control are seen as pivotal, seriously weakening England's ability to resist invasion. Tostig's wrath not only fractured the unity of Harold's reign, but may have also stirred William of Normandy to press his claim, reminding him of England's vulnerability. By allying himself with Harald Hardrada, Tostig helped unleash the devastating Norse invasion that claimed countless lives at the Battle of Fulford. Though Harold Godwinson's army was victorious at Stamford Bridge, it came at a terrible cost. His army was now depleted after 2 battles against the Norsemen, and he was then forced to march south to face yet another enemy. The final confrontation at Hastings, some argue, might have ended differently had the Godwinsons stood united, if Tostig had never been exiled. In that alternative future, the Norse might have never landed, and William of Normandy may have found himself crushed beneath the full strength of a united English kingdom. Therefore, Tostig's exile can be seen not merely as a personal downfall, but as the catalyst for the twin disasters of 1066, the Norse invasion and the Norman conquest. Yet, Tostig's legacy did not die with him. His bloodline endured. His sons, though banished from their homeland, survived, fleeing to Norway after Stamford Bridge. They found protection at the royal court. One of them, Skuli Tostigson, likely born before Tostig's marriage to Edith of Flanders, rose to prominence in his adopted land. In time, his descendants would shape the future of Norway. Skuli became the great-great-grandfather of King Ingne II of Norway, founding a noble and royal lineage that would carry the legacy of Tostig Godwinson far beyond the shores of England. Amid the turbulent tides of 11th century England, Edith of Wessex emerges as a woman of extraordinary intellect, political insight, and enduring cultural importance. As Queen Consort to Edward the Confessor from the years 1045 until his death in the year 1066, she bore witness to one of the most volatile chapters in English history, ultimately becoming the last Anglo-Saxon Queen of England. Though history often casts its spotlight on more dramatic figures of the age, such as her brother King Harold Godwinson, her husband King Edward the Confessor, and inevitably William the Conqueror, Edith's life offers a compelling glimpse into the intricate web of pre-conquest politics and the influential, if often overlooked, role of royal women. This is her story. Born in around the year 1025, Edith of Wessex was the daughter of Godwin, the Earl of Wessex, one of the most powerful and influential men in England, and his wife, Gytha Thorkelsdottir, a noblewoman of distinguished Danish lineage. Gytha was the sister of Ulf, a Danish earl and brother-in-law to King Cnut the Great, which gave Edith ties to both the English and Danish power structures. From birth, she stood at the very heart of Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, shaped by a legacy of political might and noble bloodlines. Understanding the value of learning for a woman destined for a high station, Earl Godwin arranged for Edith to be raised and educated in Wilton Abbey, one of the finest centres of learning for noblewomen in all of England. At Wilton Abbey, Edith received an education that far surpassed what was customary for women of her time. She became fluent in 5 languages: English, Danish, French, Irish, and Latin, a rare and remarkable achievement that would later equip her to navigate the diverse and sophisticated court of Edward the Confessor. Alongside her academic studies, she mastered the traditional feminine arts of embroidery and weaving, skills deeply respected in Anglo-Saxon culture for their beauty, symbolism, and social value. Edith of Wessex lived through one of the most turbulent and transformative periods in English history. Her father, Godwin, had risen to prominence under the rule of King Cnut the Great, the formidable Viking monarch who held dominion over England, Denmark, and Norway. Elevated to the powerful title of Earl of Wessex, Godwin became one of Cnut's most trusted advisors, likely possessing deep knowledge of the inner workings of the vast North Sea Empire. But the stability of Cnut's reign was not to last. In the year 1035, he died unexpectedly at the age of around 45, leaving behind a contested succession. His son, Harold Harefoot, took the throne, and Edith, then just a child of about 10, would have witnessed the uncertainty that followed. Harold ruled from 1035 until his death in the year 1040, after which his half-brother Harthacnut succeeded him. But Harthacnut's reign was short-lived. He ruled for only 2 years before meeting a mysterious end, poisoned during a wedding feast, his murderer lost to history. Through these years of shifting kings and uneasy alliances, Earl Godwin managed to retain his power and influence, skillfully navigating the political upheaval of successive Viking rulers. But with Harthacnut's death, the line of Cnut came to an end, and so too did the era of Viking rule in England. Into this void stepped Edward the Confessor, son of the ousted Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred the Unready, the very man who had lost England to the Vikings. After nearly 30 years in exile, Edward was invited back to reclaim his father's throne. Thus, a new chapter began for England as the throne returned to the House of Wessex. Earl Godwin was instrumental in securing Edward the Confessor's return to the English throne. However, their alliance was fraught with personal animosity. Edward had long harboured a deep resentment toward Godwin, whom he blamed for the brutal death of his brother, Alfred the Atheling. Still, political necessity outweighed private grievance. Edward, lacking a solid power base of his own, was compelled to lean on Godwin's military strength and widespread influence. As part of this fragile political truce, Edith of Wessex, then 20 years old, was married to King Edward on January the 23rd of the year 1045. The king was roughly 42 years old at the time. Their wedding took place at the Old Minster in Winchester, and Edith was crowned queen. Most royal consorts of the 10th and 11th centuries were not granted this honour, and her coronation underscored both her personal status and the immense political weight of the Godwin family. The marriage between Edward and Edith was a union of power, not passion, and has long intrigued historians. It remained childless, leading to speculation about its true nature. Medieval church chroniclers, eager to portray Edward's pious image, claimed he had taken a vow of celibacy, casting him as a king too holy for earthly pleasures. Modern scholars, however, suggest other possibilities, that Edward's lingering hostility toward the Godwins led him to distance himself from Edith, or that infertility of one or both parties played a role. Whatever the truth, Edward treated Edith with outward respect. He bestowed upon her valuable estates across England and ensured her continued presence at court. As queen, Edith exercised real influence, participating in royal ceremonies and overseeing elements of administration. The uneasy alliance between King Edward and the powerful Godwin family finally shattered in the autumn of the year 1051, erupting into open crisis. Tensions had long been simmering, fueled in part by Edward's increasing reliance on Norman advisors. The breaking point came in September, when Edward ordered Godwin to punish the town of Dover, following a violent altercation involving Eustace of Boulogne, one of the king's Norman allies. Godwin and his sons defied the royal command, refusing to act against their own countrymen. Edward seized the moment to strike against the family that had overshadowed his rule for years. With the backing of the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, he expelled Godwin and his sons from England, effectively dismantling their political stronghold. The downfall of the Godwins had swift and painful consequences for Edith of Wessex. Though she was a crowned and anointed queen, her royal status could not shield her. She was sent to a nunnery, her lands confiscated, and there is strong evidence that Edward contemplated divorcing her, perhaps due to the childless marriage, or more likely, as part of a broader effort to sever ties with her disgraced family. This episode of Edith's life lays bare the vulnerability of royal women in Anglo-Saxon England, whose power and position were often bound tightly to the fortunes of their male relatives. Despite her elevated status and years of service as queen, Edith could be cast aside when political necessity dictated. Yet her fall from grace would not last long. In the year 1052, her father Godwin and her brothers returned to England with a formidable fleet and military force. Confronted with the real threat of civil war and lacking sufficient support to resist them, Edward was compelled to restore the Godwins to power. As part of this reconciliation, Edith was reinstated as queen and returned to court, her titles and properties restored. After her restoration to court, Edith resumed her role as a central and commanding presence in the reign of Edward the Confessor. She took particular care in curating the dignity and splendour of the crown, overseeing the commissioning of exquisite garments and fine jewellery for Edward. Her power was not merely ceremonial. The Domesday Book, compiled some 20 years after her death by William the Conqueror, records Edith as one of the wealthiest landowners in England, with vast estates scattered across the realm. This wealth afforded her considerable political leverage, allowing her to dispense patronage, reward loyalty, and sustain a network of allies. Among her closest confidants was her brother Tostig, whose elevation to the earldom of Northumbria in the year 1055 was likely aided by Edith's influence at court. Their bond, however, would later cast a shadow over her legacy. Tostig's harsh governance provoked a northern rebellion in the year 1065, and some chroniclers whispered that Edith had played a dark role in an earlier scandal, the assassination of the Northumbrian nobleman Gospatrick during the Christmas of the year 1064. Such accounts reveal how Edith was perceived in her time not only as a queen, but as a shrewd political operator, willing to act decisively, even ruthlessly in defence of her family's power. In the final year of Edward's life, as his health declined, Edith's ceremonial role became ever more prominent. On December the 28th of the year 1065, she stood in his place at the dedication of Westminster Abbey, Edward's grand architectural legacy and spiritual offering to the kingdom. King Edward the Confessor died on January the 5th of the year 1066, setting in motion one of the most legendary and famous succession crises in English history. According to the Vita Edwardi Regis, a contemporary chronicle commissioned by Edith herself, Edward on his deathbed named her brother Harold Godwinson as his heir. The following day, the Witan, the King's Royal Council, confirmed Harold's claim and proclaimed him king. For Edith, these events marked a profound turning point. Though no longer queen consort, her brother's ascension to the throne ensured she retained honour, influence, and a central place in the royal court. But this new chapter in her life would be both brief and brutal. Harold's reign was immediately challenged by Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, and William, the Duke of Normandy. The ensuing conflicts culminated in the Battle of Fulford and Stamford Bridge, where Harold Godwinson defeated Hardrada. However, at Hastings, fate did not favour him, and he was slain, and with him, the last great hope of Anglo-Saxon rule. For Edith, the Norman conquest was not only a national upheaval, but a deep personal tragedy. She lost 4 brothers in the battles of Stamford Bridge and Hastings. Only her youngest brother Wulfnoth survived, doomed to live out his days as a hostage under Norman control. In the space of mere weeks, the mighty Godwin family, once the most powerful force in England, was shattered. When William's army advanced on Winchester, where she was residing, he sent emissaries demanding tribute. Edith, ever pragmatic and politically astute, complied. In return, William permitted her to retain the majority of her estates and income. This careful diplomacy ensured that Edith became one of the few Anglo-Saxon nobles to emerge from the conquest with her status largely preserved. One of Edith's most enduring legacies was her commissioning of the biography of her husband, King Edward the Confessor, a work known as the Vita Edwardi Regis, the life of King Edward who rests at Westminster. Composed in around the year 1067 by an anonymous monk from Flanders, this near-contemporary account is among the most valuable sources for understanding the final years of Anglo-Saxon England and the events surrounding the Norman conquest. Far more than a simple royal tribute, the Vita was crafted to elevate Edward's piety and kingship, while also subtly reinforcing the legitimacy and prestige of the Godwin family. Its pages are clearly sympathetic to Edith and her kin, offering a counterpoint to the emerging Norman narrative that would come to dominate historical memory. In doing so, it preserves a vital Anglo-Saxon perspective on a kingdom in transition. Edith would die in the year 1075 in Winchester after a prolonged illness. She was around 50 years old. Though the Norman conquest had changed the realm, William the Conqueror recognised Edith's royal stature and ensured she was laid to rest with honour, buried beside her husband in Westminster Abbey. Edith of Wessex holds a singular place in English history as the last queen of Anglo-Saxon England. Her life encompassed the reign of the Danish kings, the twilight of native English rule, and the dawn of Norman power, making her a living thread that stitched together 3 distinct eras. I would like to give a huge thank you to all of my members. Your contribution is valuable to the continuation of the channel, and I appreciate you all immensely. A special thank you to John Seitz. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, Be sure to like, subscribe and share, and I'll see you all next week for another History Profile.